In today's lesson, we're going to learn what trend lines are and how to draw them. And by the end, you'll learn and understand how to summarize scatter plot data with trend lines. So why do we use them? Scatter plots, as we've learned previously, help us to see relationships between variables. For example, if we look at something like hours studied and test score, the points form a positive linear pattern, but they don't lie exactly on a single line. And so to summarize the pattern, we draw a trend line. And a trend line is a line that approximates the general pattern of the data. And it's sometimes called a line of best fit. So we turn each one of these points, each one of these observations in our two-way table into a coordinate pair. We draw an x and a y axis and label them with the independent and dependent variables. Then we plot each one of these points on the axis, and if we choose, we will label the independent and dependent points. And then we put the trend line on there, and a trend line is used to approximate the general pattern of data in a scatter plot. And another name for a trend line is a line of best fit. So when we're drawing a trend line, what should it look like? Well, there's a few things a good trend line does. A good trend line should follow the overall direction of the points. We want to try to have about the same number of points above the line as we have below the line, and we want it to pass through the middle of the cluster of data. The line doesn't need to pass through every point. In fact, it's generally impossible for the line to pass through every point, but we do want it to pass through the middle of the points. So let me show you a few examples of a bad trend line. Here's an example of a bad trend line. This trend line is too high. If you look at our second bullet point, it says we want roughly the same number of points above and below the line. And this line that I have drawn here has far too many points below and very few points above. Likewise, we can get another bad trend line that is too low. This has the opposite problem, too many points that are above the trend line and not very many points below. And then, of course, we could have a trend line that's exceptionally bad because it completely misses the pattern. This is a scatter plot with a positive association, but yet I have drawn a trend line that is negative. My line is going down, but my scatter plot is going up. So an example of a good trend line would be something like this that goes exactly through the middle of the points, or as close to exactly as I can get it. It's a good trend line because it is balanced above and below with about the same number of points. And notice that this trend line does not go through any of the points. None of the scatter plot points are actually on the trend line, but it's still a good trend line because it goes through the middle of the points. Trend lines help us describe relationships between variables, make predictions, and model overall patterns. So what are the steps to drawing a trend line? Well, the first thing that we want to do is identify the overall direction of the data. And this scatter plot we have here is a negative association, and so we want a trend line that's going to be negative. The second thing that we want to do is place a line through the center of the cluster, trying to keep about half the points above and half below. So we would put a line on our scatter plot, maybe use a ruler or something like that, and we would move the line across the scatter plot, trying to find where is the spot on this scatter plot where we have exactly half the number of points above and below, trying to get as close as we possibly can. And so this seems like a reasonably good estimate of where the trend line would be. It follows the overall direction of the data, passes through the middle of the data cluster, and has about the same number of points above and below the line. We've got about 8 points above the line and about 8 points below the line, so it's a pretty reasonable estimate for the trend line. So let's go back to our hours studied and test score two-way table. This is what the scatter plot looks like, and let's go ahead and draw a trend line through the scatter plot. So as we said, trend lines help us describe relationships, make predictions, and model real-world situations. And making predictions is one of the biggest values to a trend line. Now that I have drawn a trend line through this data, let's ask ourselves, what test score would I predict for someone who studied for 5 hours? So in order to do that, I would go along the x-axis where I have hours studied, and I would look for an x value of 5, which of course is going to be just a little bit after 4. And I would go up to my line and find an x value of 5, and I would see if I could find what is the y value when x is 5. And that would give me a prediction for someone who studied for 5 hours. So when is it appropriate to use a trend line? Well, there's really only one time when you should use a trend line, and that is when you have a linear association. That is when trend lines work best, when the data shows a linear association. If we have a non-linear pattern, or if we have no association at all, we do not want to use a trend line. Trend lines work best when the data shows a linear association. So what have we learned? A trend line models the overall pattern of the data. It does not pass through every point. In fact, as you saw earlier, sometimes it doesn't pass through any points, and it's only useful for linear relationships. And then in the next lesson, we're going to use trend lines to continue to make predictions, and we're going to interpret the slope of the trend line and how it applies to the relationship that we're modeling.